Why do you watch the Chinese news, man? Yeah, because I'm a Chinese secret agent. Anyway, as soon as I saw this, I thought to myself, planes are falling out of the sky yet again. Here we go again, right? Anyway, there's been some talk of a false flag, right? Putin is going to create a false flag event. The United States will create a false flag event. But maybe if there is to one, and I hope not, maybe we're all looking in the wrong place. I don't know. I'm not saying this is anything, but the way that plane just pow drove or was looks like was pow driven into the ground. I mean, the wonders of CGI. Hey, who knows? Maybe it was real. Maybe it was real. Anyway, since the topic of false flags been on a lot of people's minds recently, let's talk about what has all the markings of a false flag, right? The death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The death of one man who at one point wasn't very significant at all. And by a string of very convenient, inconvenient, weird circumstances all of a sudden became relevant, if only for a moment, if only to help bring about that which was predicted to come about. World War One, right? Are these people sages? Or are they just being fed a certain script? Who knows, right? Anyway, Franz Ferdinand, the man whose death caused World War One. I remember learning about this incident in various schools, different languages, and they never failed to mention this guy and his name, and sometimes not at all, or just secondarily, they'd mention the tens of millions or 100 million, however many millions of people that died in the conflict, right? They wanted me to know, if there was nothing else I was going to know about this war, was that it was this poor bastard's death that caused it. Okay, great. Reading from this article, and look, I don't know how much of this is accurate or even if it's in line with the mainstream narrative, but here it is. This is as good a source as any insofar as the mainstream goes, right? It was the shot heard around the world on June 28, 1914, on a sweltering street in Sarajevo. A gunman fired into an open-topped car. Another, because it was hot, right? Oh, these cars with open tops, man. It's not funny, it's just sad. Killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The murder of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the push that set the dominoes of Europe falling. One by one, the great nations declared war until countries as far away as India, Japan, and America had all been sucked into the quagmire. Known as World War One, that quagmire would kill 20 million people. That's it? I've heard other numbers, but you know, everybody got their own propaganda, I guess. And change the curse of history. Oh man, this is what happens. Get out of here. Anyway, I guess we're not gonna read that sentence. Born into a branch of the Austrian royal family, right? Another germ. Franz Ferdinand seemed destined for a life of rich obscurity until one day, right? Seemed destined for a life of rich obscurity. He was going to be a nobody. Until one day, tragic events conspired. Events conspired, right? Is that a metaphor? Moving on. Conspired to make him heir to his family's empire. As emperor in waiting, Ferdinand implemented reforms and worked on plans that could have changed everything, only for an assassin's bullet to cut him down too soon. Uh, so maybe he was doing some things that somebody didn't like. Reforms, right? Or maybe he was told to implement certain reforms that somebody knew somebody else wouldn't like and would be easy to convince to snuff him out. Only for an assassin's bullet to cut him down too soon. In today's biographics, we're investigating the life of the man whose death started World War I and considering what might have happened had he lived. Hmm. She only had one order, right? It wasn't that important, I guess. The two heirs. At the moment Franz Ferdinand first opened his eyes on 18 December 1863, not even the greatest seer could have predicted the tortured route that would lead him dying on an anonymous Sarajevo street half a century later. Not even the greatest seer could have predicted World War I, but a bunch of them did. Cute little baby. At the time, Sarajevo was within the orbit of the decaying Ottoman Empire. Franz Ferdinand, meanwhile, had been born into the chilly air. Oh man, this is pretty good writing, right? Born on a chilly morning, died on a sweltering afternoon. Born into the chilly air of the Ottomans' ancient enemy, Austria. Not that being enemies meant the empires were at war. In fact, they were in a period of relative peace that allowed Ferdinand's ostensibly military family to become lazy and boring, and probably for other militaries, allowed other countries to build up their militaries, right? That's what the times of peace seem to be used for. Ferdinand's father, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was as staid and conservative as a church bell tower. His mother, Maria Annunziata, was a Bourbon princess who'd done nothing of note, right? They were kind of nobodies, right? Insofar as the elites are concerned. Yet, all their dull respectability, the family did have one claim on being interesting. Karl Ludwig was the brother of Franz Joseph, the Habsburg Emperor of Austria, right? Not that baby Franz Ferdinand got much out of his famous uncle, since Franz Joseph already had a son, Rudolf. There was little chance young Ferdinand could have ever become emperor himself. Obviously, it wasn't impossible. He was third in line. But it was unlikely. Huh. Curious fashion of the day. Looks like a revolutionary soldier or something, right? America. But it was unlikely enough that Ferdinand was kept away from the corridors of power, even as he had to go through the standard Habsburg upbringing of God, army, and duty. Oh no. So we got the religious aspect. Let's just stick to the realm of prophecy. The army that carries the shit out, and his responsibility in all of it. In fact, Franz Ferdinand's upbringing was so utterly average that there's very little to say about it. Perhaps the only way the boy diverged from the standard Habsburg mold was in his passion for botany. He's probably smoking that That tweed. While other Habsburg men valued their guns and uniforms, Franz Ferdinand found an unlikely outlet in flowers, right? He was a flower child, a hippie. From early childhood, it's said that he never looked quite as content as when he was gently pressing a rose between the pages of a book. So maybe he was, a little fruity and, a bit of an embarrassment for the family. Still, it's not like Ferdinand's horticultural side was a sign of an artistic spirit. He really did value guns and uniforms and enjoyed his conservative upbringing. The same cannot be said for Rudolf. The only son of Emperor Franz Joseph, Crown Prince Rudolf had been born on August 21, 1858, ending a run of unwanted baby girls. I should install an ad blocker, right? Blah blah blah. No word on how the previous commander felt about being replaced by a literally newborn baby. So they made Rudolf the commander of the entire infantry the day after he was born. But while his cousin Franz Ferdinand would enjoy his military upbringing, Rudolf had hated it from the get go. From a young age, Rudolf had been pushed into a sadistic tutor named Major General Count Leopold Gondrecourt. Jesus, Gondrecourt. Gondrecourt was that asshole phys ed teacher you had as a kid, pumped up on 19th century notions of manliness and giving carte blanche to do whatever he. Whoa. Whoa. To do whatever he liked to Rudolph. Whoa. The crown prince was made to exercise outdoors for hours in the depths of the Austrian winter. Guns were fired near his head in the middle of the night to wake him up. Are you serious? By 1865, Rudolph was a mental wreck, but still, Franz Joseph refused to fire Gondrecourt, believing Rudolph was a weakling who needed toughening up. Finally, Empress Sissi intervened, threatening to leave the royal household if Gondecourt kept abusing their son. But by then, the damage had already been done. Always a sensitive boy, Rudolph would never recover from the hard years he spent in the hands of Count Gondecourt. It was these mental scars that would soon entwine his fate with Franz Ferdinand's. By the early 1880s, the two cousins had grown into very different people. Off on his family's estates, Franz Ferdinand had become exactly the sort of man the newly reorganized Austro-Hungarian Empire was designed to churn out. He'd join the army, become a captain within a year. I'm sure no nepotism was involved. Now he was in his early 20s and climbing the ranks, ready to serve his country. Even his love of flowers had been offset by a newfound passion for the masculine sport of hunting. And no one hunted quite like Franz Ferdinand, so I guess he was quite the shot. If it moved and it wasn't wearing an Austrian army uniform, then Ferdinand was more than happy to shoot it. It's estimated he shot over 250,000 animals in his lifetime. But despite the outward success of Ferdinand's military upbringing, it hadn't sanded off all the rough edges. Adult FF was a man with a volcanic temper. Like many rich people, he was used to getting what he wanted, but whereas most rich people sulk in private when they don't, Ferdinand sulked openly for days on end. It got so bad that his army buddies would avoid him like most of us would avoid a pedophile made of Ebola. Jeez. Still, at least Franz Ferdinand was broadly content. The same can't be said for Rudolf. In the years since Count Gondrecourt had been kicked out on his sadistic backside, Ferdinand's cousin had gone from bad to worse. He'd become melancholic, alcoholic, other colics that medical science hasn't even dreamed of. Yet, even as emotionally decayed, Rudolf intellectually sharpened. At the time of our story, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was home to a kaleidoscope of ethnicities. There were Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Italians, Croats, Slovenes, Serbs, Romanians, Ukrainians. However, only Austrians and Hungarians were represented at the top. While that had been common in the empires of the past, it wasn't so viable in a Europe now brimming with nationalism. As future emperor, Rudolf was desperate to reform things. Unfortunately, his father's motto was essentially do nothing and hope for the best. Franz Joseph was slow, conservative, as suspicious of demands for autonomy as he was out of his heir's reforming zeal. But rather than talk about it, Franz Joseph simply sidelined Rudolf, marrying him off to Princess Sophie of Belgium, a woman so dull she could have been used as an anesthetic. Frustrated at court, stuck with the wife he hated, and still dealing with the scars of his abusive childhood, Rudolf began to drift into a poisonous depression. Interestingly, it was around this time that Franz Ferdinand's life also took a grim turn. In the mid 1880s, the third in line to the throne was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a lung disease that killed many in the 19th century, right? So he was terminally ill. But things were worse for Rudolf. So this family was just falling apart, it would seem, right? Uh, Also, due in part, in my opinion, probably, to all the them inbreeding, right? While Franz Ferdinand's disease was something that could be understood, Rudolf's disease was something that hid away from sight, something his family didn't even try to understand. It was an attitude that would lead to tragedy. On January 30th, 1889, Rudolf, now extremely depressed, took his 17-year-old lover, Baroness Mary Vetsera, to his hunting lodge in Mayerling. There, the two signed a suicide pact. Then Rudolf shot her through the head before turning his pistol on himself. Uh, Not sure how that's a suicide on her part, but okay. The bullet that passed through Rudolf's brain did more than kill the crown prince. It ended Franz Joseph's line, extinguishing his only male heir. It was a moment when history trembled, then pivoted on its axis. What? When the multiverse branched. Okay. Poor Franz Ferdinand did not know it yet, but Rudolph's two gunshots had just set him on a path to his own, equally violent destiny. The heir is dead, long live the heir. All of the unintended consequences of Rudolph's suicide, of all the unintended consequences of Rudolph's suicide, Franz Ferdinand becoming heir was likely the most unintended of all. I mean, depends on who you ask, I guess. That's because Ferdinand was the third in line to the throne. After Rudolf decided to decorate Mayerling's walls with the inside of his skull, the succession passed to Ferdinand's dad, Karl Ludwig. But Karl wasn't interested. Within days, he'd abdicated his claim. Right? No orders on this man either, huh? And just like that, Franz Ferdinand, hot-headed military flower-loving Franz Ferdinand, was the future emperor, right? One because his brother had offed himself, or cousin, whatever, had offed himself, and his dad didn't want any. For Emperor Franz Joseph, this was little like being forced to swallow a pint of freshly squeezed disappointment. So I guess he didn't really want to do this either. Francis Ferdinand and Joseph, Franz Ferdinand and Joseph did not get on. The emperor was a reserved man who never showed emotion to anyone but his beloved wife, Sisi. While Franz Ferdinand, well, let's just say the sulking and the volcanic temper had not improved with age. Even though Karl Ludwig abdicated his claim, Franz Joseph refused to name Ferdinand his heir. He claimed Ferdinand's tuberculosis made him unfit to be emperor, right? That he might die at any moment. So in 1892, Franz Ferdinand set off for warmer climates, desperate to relieve his infected lungs. For the next 2 years, the Archduke traveled the world, seeing the sights, taking the air. And of course, shooting everything in sight. Ferdinand shot kangaroos in Australia, tigers in India, rare birds in Japan. When he returned in 1894, he actually brought two stuffed elephants he shot back with him. Franz Joseph's response, he declared his nephew's hobby was mass murder. Proto-vegans, huh? But while the trip may have been bad for exotic wildlife, it had been good for Franz Ferdinand's lungs. The hair returned revitalized better than he'd been in years. Barely had he reached the empire, then he was attending balls in Prague. It was here that the stuffy Archduke Countess met Countess Sophie Chotek. In the entire history of Franz Ferdinand's life, there was almost nobody who remembered him fondly. He was too quick to anger, too prone to sulking, too much of an asshole. The one exception was Sophie Chotek. Somehow, this bohemian countess brought out a side in this gruff, unlikable man that no one else ever saw. A side that was tender, respectful. Maybe Sophie was the closest human equivalent Ferdinand ever found to one of his flowers. Something rare and radiant that made him feel things that he otherwise never experienced. Naturally, Franz Joseph hated her. Sophie may have been rich, but she was a mere countess. For the snobbish Habsburgs, that just wasn't posh enough, so the emperor forbade their union, pushed his new heir away, just as he'd once pushed Rudolf away. Unlike Rudolf, though, Franz Ferdinand was willing to fight. All through that miserable decade, the heir argued with the emperor. He argued with him as Karl Ludwig succumbed to typhoid fever. As Empress Sissi was felled by an assassin in Geneva, finally in 1900, Ferdinand hit the jackpot. So his wife, right, who may have given birth to an heir, right? Doesn't matter who did it. We just say it was Carl right before he croaked, right? It was his last hurrah. So she was eliminated. Just like that, bam, gone. Okay. After years of cajoling, Pope Leo the 13th, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Tsar Nicholas II all pleaded to Franz Joseph on Ferdinand's behalf. Faced with the head of his religion, the head of his closest allied nation, and the head of the nation he desperately wanted to be allied with, all appealing to him, Franz Joseph at last relented. The emperor allowed Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek to marry that very year, but there was a catch. So the two cousins, right, that went to war, World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas II, wanted Ferdinand to be the heir, right? Before he could tie the knot, Franz Ferdinand was made to sign a note excluding both his children from the line of succession and Sophie from all official ceremonies, right? So before he could become heir, he had to sign a contract basically that would exclude anybody from his line of succession, right? It was a high price to pay, but it was the only offer Franz Ferdinand would ever get. Reluctantly, he agreed, right? So this line was basically doomed, right? Some of it was probably just circumstances or whatever, but assassinations, right? Murder, suicides. It gets better, right? Oaths. Just these people, it was their time to go, I guess, right? Because they were, I guess, maybe they had inbred too much and they were too frail or something, and that was it. Or too many people, families to share the pie with. It's doubtful anyone realized it, but at that moment, the multiverse breached yet again, taking the empire even further from peace, from survival. Franz Joseph may not have realized it, but his obstinacy had just doomed them all. The spirit of Rudolph. What do you mean he didn't realize it? Really? It's all just circumstance? Yeah, okay. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it is one of those misquotes that has been attributed to just about anybody. But in the context of early 20th century Austria-Hungary, it's absolutely something Franz Joseph should have kept in mind. Having contributed to Rudolph's breakdown by isolating him at court and forcing him to marry someone he had nothing in common with, the emperor was now turning his guns on his heir. The marriage of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek had been a personal insult to Franz Joseph. He instructed everyone at court to ignore Ferdinand's new wife. At the same time, he began pushing his nephew away from the business of government, castrating him politically. Rudolf had tried to reform the empire but been sidelined. And now Franz Ferdinand was about to suffer the same fate. Why did Franz Joseph so singularly fail both his heirs? There's a lot of debate about this, but one possible reason is that he ascended to the throne when he was just 18 and simply wasn't aware that most future emperors needed guidance, needed teaching. When Ferdinand tried to follow in Rudolf's footsteps and modernize the empire, he got neither of those things. The emperor just blanked him, right? It's like he knew that this was the end of the line or something. And this was a problem because at the dawn of the 20th century, Franz Ferdinand was the only one with ideas for holding the Austro Hungarian Empire together, right? No, no, this this empire has run its course, right? Because Russia and Germany uh, want to share the spoils. Like Rudolf Ferdinand had become obsessed with the issue of nationalism in the multi-ethnic empire. But while Rudolf had tried to implement minor reforms, Ferdinand wanted to overhaul the whole system. Franz Ferdinand's plans ranged from splitting the empire into a United States of Austria to elevating the South Slavs, aka the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, to joint ruler status alongside the Austrians and Hungarians, right? So Yugoslavia, basically. But don't go thinking Ferdinand was a Rudolf-style liberal. Oh no. The man was a reactionary conservative who hated Hungarians, hated Slavs, wasn't all that hot on Jews, and thought Austria had a God-given right to stomp all over its minorities, right? He was, in short, a very unpleasant dude. But here's the thing about unpleasant dudes. They can sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reason. Franz Ferdinand's plans for libera- liberalizing what? Liberalizing the empire, granting all men the vote, and giving each nationality more autonomy may have come from a cynical calculation that it was the only way to keep his family in power, but it really would have improved things for millions. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that a reformed federal Austria-Hungary would have survived right up to today. But we'll never know for sure because Franz Joseph nixed every single plan Ferdinand had. In the court, those stifled reforms turned Franz Ferdinand into a laughing stock. It was whispered in Vienna that the heir was clinically insane, that his family's inbreeding had caught up with him, right? For a while, Ferdinand tried to brave the storm, but even this insanely unpopular man wasn't immune to public opinion. In the mid 1900s, Ferdinand and Sophie abruptly quit Vienna. They retired to their home of Nopiste in what is now the Czech Republic and settled down to a life of domestic bliss. It was almost a happy ending. Together, the couple had 3 children, and Franz Ferdinand settled back into his old passion of horticulture, creating one of the world's largest rose gardens. In another time, in another place, that might have been the end of things. With Sophie a happy mother, and Ferdinand quietly pressing his roses by candlelight, all the cares of empire forgotten. But this was Europe in the early 20th century, a tinderbox less than a decade away from exploding. For Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, there would be no peace. The wheels were already in motion. Hmm. Their violent fate was waiting for them. Death in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie disembarked from a train in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo and stepped into an open-topped car. It was a hot day, and the river running through the center of the city was lower than usual. But as the motorcade whipped past, it wasn't the river the Archduke should have been looking at. It was the crowds. Near the city's old Latin bridge, Nadeliko Kabrinovic and Gavrilo Princip waited anonymous waited, anonymous faces amid the assembled masses. In the pockets of their heavy coats sat bombs and guns. Near their trembling fingertips lay cyanide capsules. They and their comrades had one goal: to kill the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to understand why we need to quickly wind back Father Time's videotape. So they had planned to kill him, obviously, and then commit suicide. This is very much like, the brainwashed suicide bombers of today, right? Or the original assassins or assassins, whatever the hell they were called, however you pronounce it, right? The Islamic warriors who were promised unlimited virgins in heaven if, well, they did what they had to do. So, clearly maybe it isn't so clear, but it would stand to reason that there are other forces behind this sort of. This is like a Manchurian candidate type of thing, right? Someone who's brainwashed and willing to, you know, they're brainwashed to carry out some kind of an agenda to the end of a goal that they themselves won't be able to, if successful, won't be able to enjoy, right? So just martyrs sacrificing themselves. I mean, come on, man. Remember when we told you Sarajevo was part of the decaying Ottoman Empire? Well, 15 years after Franz Ferdinand's birth, 1878, the Ottoman Empire had completely decayed in the Balkans, losing nearly all its territories. Into this power vacuum, the Austro-Hungarians had marched, taking over Bosnia and on the strict understanding that they were only there to keep the region from imploding. But Vienna and Budapest had no intention of ever leaving. In 1908, they had officially annexed the region. But rather than, right, and that's the region that the West and East have been, just like Central, but this is Central Europe, I guess. All of Central Europe, all the historic Slavic lands, right? The Germans and the Russians, which are really, insofar as the elites are concerned, just more Germans, have been fighting for, right? An outraged Russia had permanently turned its back on Austria-Hungary. In the Balkans, Serbs had declared the empire their mortal enemy. And now Kabrinovic and Princip were determined to make the empire pay. Interestingly, they nearly didn't get their chance. The night before, Franz Ferdinand had a premonition that all would not be well in Sarajevo. Did somebody warn him of the plot, right? Did he put two and two together because there was all this shady shit going on that we don't even know about? Something was telling him like something ain't right here, right? Right. But it was his and Sophie's wedding anniversary, and all these semi-unofficial trips with minimal security were the only ones friends Joseph allowed Sophie to go on. What? But it was his and Sophie's wedding anniversary, and these semi-unofficial trips with minimal security were the only ones Franz Joseph allowed Sophie to go on. So here the couple were speeding alongside the half-dry river in Sarajevo, blissfully unaware of the man waiting to kill them. As well, sounds like Franz was aware of something. As the car roared past the Latin Bridge, Kabrinovic whipped out a bomb and hurled it. But the bomb bounced off the car and hit the police escort behind, blowing them up instead. In a panic, Kabrinovic forgot his gun and tried to commit suicide by leaping into the river, only to land on a dried out bank, missing the water and breaking his legs. Oh, God. As Gavrilo Princip watched in a daze, the car carrying his and Kabrinovic's target motored away at speed. He'd failed, except, as you already know, he hadn't. What came next was like something out of a tragic farce. It's just a farce, right? Unfortunate circumstance. The car carrying Ferdinand and Sophie stopped at the city hall as scheduled, but rather than focus on getting the hell away from Sarajevo, everyone carried on like nothing had happened. What? Rather than focus on getting the hell away from Sarajevo, everyone carried on like nothing had happened. Once the ceremony was over, Franz Ferdinand even insisted on driving back into town to check on the wounded. Sounds like he knew it was his time to go. Sounds like, the guy was terminally ill, had a fucked up life. There was no future for his family insofar as the heirs, right? The whole family was just, looks like they were being eliminated from the scene. And, he decided to go back to the scene of the crime where they almost murdered him, right? After he maybe had second thoughts about doing it the night before. As someone who had been there that day later said, we all felt awkward because we knew that when he went out, he would certainly be killed. We all felt awkward because we knew that when he went out, he would certainly be killed. Okay. Do we need to read that sentence? It's a direct quote, right? One more time, do we? Yet No one stopped the Archduke from getting back in the car. No one told the driver to take a different route in case more assassins were waiting. And no one raised a finger as Ferdinand and Sophie headed back towards the Latin Bridge, where Gavrilo Princip was still standing in shock, unable to believe he'd missed his chance to assassinate the Austrian heir. One can only wonder how he felt when he saw the car motoring back toward him, like a moving target going round a shooting range carousel, giving him another shot at the grand prize. I mean, it's all here, isn't it? It was a shot Princip gladly took. The first bullet hit Sophie, killing her almost instantly. The second thudded into Francis Ferdinand's chest, turning his bright blue uniform a brilliant red. As the crowd set upon Princip, the car sped away from the scene. In the back, Franz Ferdinand held poor, dead Sophie Chotek, whispering in her lifeless ear, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for the children." As news broke that evening that the heir to the Austrian throne had been assassinated, Europe plunged into a state of shock. In every capital, in every embassy, people wondered what it might mean, if it even meant anything. But make no mistake, this was old Europe's 9/11, the moment that would change everything. So, this author is giving you clues, a whole bunch of different clues, right? Of sexual degeneracy, connotations of sexual degeneracy, right? Pedophilia, even explicitly talking about that, alluding to it, and then pointing out all these inconsistencies, all these farces, how the family was just, you know, coincidentally falling apart. The family was just inbred and terminally ill, right? The author seems to know a lot more than he's leading on, right? Especially this sentence here. But make no mistake, this was old Europe's 9/11, right? So, I don't know. Keep your head up, everybody. Look out for fallen planes. Take care.